Good morning, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing Pravrajika. Almost said Swami, she is one. Pravrajika Virajaprana from San Francisco, who came down with two of her other sisters for the nuns' conference yesterday. I hope all of you had a chance to either see it online or in person. But she'll be giving the talk this morning on From the River of Time into Timelessness. Swami, I'm going to call you Swami anyway. Pravrajika.
Not a problem. Apyayantu mamangani vakpranaschakshushottramato balamindriyani cha sarvani sarvam manishadam maham brahma nirakuryam mama brahma nirakarot anirakaranamastu anirakaranam mestu taratmani nirateya upanishatsu dharmaste mai santu om shanti shanti shanti. May our bodies be filled with strength, peace, and joy. May our eyes, our ears, our senses, our energy, our life, all be sweet with divine harmony. All, whatever we perceive, is verily divine. May we never cease to see God. May God never forsake us. May we be absorbed more and more in divine being, and may the glories of self-realization be manifest in and through our life and mind. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. It's really interesting, everybody with their mask on. I feel like I'm going to get held up. So Krishna Prana has told you all the title of the topic this morning, which is From the River of Time into Timelessness. What is time really? This is a tough question that scientists and philosophers and truth seekers have dealt deeply to try to find the answer. Once someone humorously remarked that time was nature's way of trying to keep everything from happening at once. No one has been able to give a clear, definitive definition of time. We all know it, however, through its effects and through our experiences in life. Our lives are dominated by it. We are driven by time. And one thing we can say with assurance is we never have enough of it. We speak about time as though it had an objective reality. And we use such expressions as time is slipping through my fingers, or I'm killing time, or time is hanging heavy on my hands. We treat time as if it's an object and we try to manipulate it. And we say things like, well, time out when the clock stops during a basketball game. Or, in economic jargon, trading time for money. We attribute qualifiers to time. We say, well, it was a short time ago. It's the remote past. It's the near future. From day to day. Now, in many cultures, time is personified, such as Father Time, or the Grim Reaper, the Great Leveler, the Great Avenger, and in our tradition, Mother Kali. Time drags all things into a ceaseless flow. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna describes himself, the divine, as time. He says, of measures, I am time. Time sweeps us along in its swift current. Our time begins here with our life and ends with our death. All of us, everything, not just the pills in our medicine cabinet, have an expiration date. Searching for life's meaning during this short interval amidst the constant reminder of this expiratory date is time-dependent. Yet paradoxically, we don't know what it is that has so much influence on our thinking and on our lives. And what's even more important, to live meaningfully for peace and for spiritual fulfillment, we have to escape from time's hold on us. Now, most of us are familiar with a wonderful children's book by Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. Swami Vivekananda was extremely fond of this book, and he felt it was the best book written for children in the 19th century. And he made a comment once while he was in Los Angeles and said he felt that Carroll had a unique insight into the workings of the human mind. And in fact, Carroll had a brilliant mathematical mind. And just as a matter of interest, there's a spin on Alice in Wonderland called Alice in Quantum Land. Now, in the first chapter of Carroll's book, Alice is sitting by a stream. It's a warm summer day. She's listening to her sister read. And she feels drowsy and she falls into kind of a sleep. And suddenly, a white rabbit with a waistcoat rushes past her. Then he pauses and he pulls a watch out of his pocket, and he says, oh dear, I'm going to be so late, and he rushes on. Now, at first, Alice took this to be quite ordinary until she thought about it. It wasn't so much that the rabbit was talking to him that got her attention, but the fact that he pulled a watch out of his pocket to see the time. Then she began to wonder exactly what she had seen. Now, we all have a little bit of Alice in the white rabbit in us. As we rush through our lives from one random chaotic thought to the next, all the while we consider that our flow of consciousness is quite connected. It's very rational, very meaningful, and we rarely focus on what the commotion is all about. Now, incongruous as it may seem, this constant state of motion that propels us through our lives, through time, from one point of view, is based on a series of numbers, 1 through 12, or multiples thereof. Let's pause just for a moment and analyze a rather bizarre phenomenon that we simply take for granted, sometimes for a whole lifetime, without questioning our strange existence in this wonderland of time. We're going to begin with just a very brief look at what we call a calendar, represent what we arbitrarily have named days and months, and a clock that is numbered 1 to 12, which consists of 3 units: seconds, minutes, and hours. Now, first of all, the old, inaccurate dating method of the Roman Republican calendar was revised by Julius Caesar. Now, unfortunately, the astronomer that advised Caesar had overestimated the length of a year by 11 minutes. And so by the end of the 16th century, the dates of the seasons had shifted 13 days. Along came Pope Gregory XIII, who wanted to reform the calendar. Basically, he wanted to restore the vernal equinox to March 21st. And today in the West, we still follow the calendar that Pope Gregory XIII established, the Gregorian calendar. Now, some of the Eastern European countries still, to some extent, follow the Julian calendar. And then there are other countries, Asian countries, that follow different methods of calculating the components of a year. For example, there is the Hindu lunar calendar that's based on phases of the moon. The Gregorian calendar is, of course, based on the solar system. And there is also the Islamic calendar, which is also based on phases of the moon, a different formulation, as is the Chinese calendar, and so on. So there are various ways that different cultures have calculated time. Now, the monthly calendar that Pope Gregory handed down to us has been refined into neat grids that run vertically and horizontally into 5 or 6 rows. And within each one of these rows are little boxes. And they're numbered 1 to 30 or 1 to 31, or 1 to 28 or 1 to 29 if it happens to be a leap year. Now, the calendar represents a certain number of days, and the sum total of which we call a month, and we give it a name. And 12 of these months we call a year. Now, these little boxes are one way we attempt to quantify and organize time. And looking at a particular box, we name it Monday, or Tuesday, or Wednesday, and so on. But what is a day, anyhow? Well, we just said it consists of 3 units. So it has 864,000 seconds, 1,440 minutes, 24 hours, or the time it takes the Earth to spin on its axis once. Now, the clock is used to measure these units within one of these little day boxes. We are so accustomed to this that, like Alice seeing a talking white rabbit rush past her, it all seems so natural that we take it for granted. Now, there's a fascinating conversation between Alice and the Mad Hatter at the Mad Tea Party about time. And Alice happened to notice that the Mad Hatter's watch didn't tell what o'clock it was, it only told the month. So she questioned him about it, and the Mad Hatter turned to her and said, "Why should it? Does your watch tell you what year it is?" And Alice, her reasoning is even more curious than the Hatter's. And she replies, "Of course not, because it stays the same year for such a long time together." Now, their mysterious conversation about time brings us to the next point. The time intervals symbolized by a clock or by a calendar that we are all so accustomed to, we often need to be reminded are not absolute quantities. Applicable, universally, steadily, unvarying flow from the infinite past to the infinite future. They're simply a matter of convenience. So most clocks dating from the ancient sundials to shadow measurement have been geared to the solar system. And by observing the celestial sphere, the ancient philosophers attempted to measure time metrically by the regularity of the revolving spheres. So they devised a method of mathematically measuring change. Now, cyclic time is intrinsic to nature. This is the Oriental view. Everything is going round and round and round. There's involution, there's evolution, there's withdrawal, there's projection. And even in external nature, everything goes in a wave-like motion, isn't it? Day follows night, night follows day. The seasons follow one after the other. Mountains are ground down, oceans rise up to follow, to formulate new mountains. Rivers change their courses. Ice ages flow into global warming. So everything goes in a cycle. And furthermore, within an individual, there are cyclic biorhythmic cycles. Everything born after recycling. Now, this is quite different from the Occidental view, linear view of the flow of time, where we are born and we march through life in a sequence of events, incorporating them into some sort of fixed, epitomized time that is shown in Shakespeare's Seven Ages of Man. And we proceed according to schedule, according to the final stage, which is death. Now, ironically, in the West, we think in a linear way, and yet we measure the passage of time cyclically. For example, just take a watch that we wear. What are we doing? We are watching the revolving motion of time. Even digital watches, they're little termination reminders. Like there's a sinister plot in the universe reminding us of our death day. I mean, we always want reminders and acknowledgement of our birthday, but daily we are wearing our death day reminders on our wrists. Now, since there's no absolute time, and considering our life is completely dominated by it, it's about time, before proceeding with this discussion, to throw out a few working definitions. So philosophically and metaphysically, time is the fourth dimension in our space-time continuum. Practically speaking, we can say that time is a point in duration. It's a moment. It's an instant. It's an interval between two events. So Time is a way, and it's an attempt to quantify in a numerical sequence, multiple successive intervals of varying duration. That's basically a practical definition of time. So just as we can say that there's no color without an eye to perceive it, in a similar way we can say an instant, an hour, a day, or a month is non-existent without an event or a happening to mark it. Swami Vivekananda, who practically deals with such abstruse subjects, says in Absolute and Manifestation, you cannot have any idea of abstract time, but you have to take two events, one preceding and the other succeeding, and join the two events by the idea of succession. Time depends on two events, just as space has to be related to outside objects. Then hinting at the elusive nature of time, Swamiji says, of space and time, Swamiji continues, they are shadows around everything which we cannot catch. So just as space is merely a possible order of material objects, so time is simply a possible and probable order of events concerning those objects. Now, time flows like a river. We all know that in our own life experience. But the rate of flow varies. It's not the same. It's not the same for different individuals, and it's not the same for a single individual. Time, as Einstein's theory so eloquently proved over 100 years ago, is relative. There is no such thing as a fixed interval of time independent of the observer. For example, what we call a year is simply a measurement of our progression through space as we rocket around the sun in a period of a year. Apparently, if we lived on Mercury, we would have a different notion of time. Mercury orbits the sun in 88 of our days, and during that time spins once on its axis. So that means on Mercury, a day and a year amount to the same thing. This is something like the Mad Hatter's watch. Now, this relativity leads us to a subtler idea of time. And that is, the sense of time is actually, it's a form of perception. It's a concept. Our time sense is completely bound up with our state of mind. Our mystics have demonstrated that time does not exist outside the mind. It exists in relation to our mind. In fact, time is a product of our mind. This subjectivity of time is explained by Einstein in this way. The experiences of an individual, he says, appear to us arranged in a series of events. In this series, the single events which we remember appear to be ordered according to the criterion of earlier or later. There exists, therefore, for the individual an I time, or subjective time. This in itself is not measurable. Now, the suggestion is given, however, that practically we can associate numbers with events in such a way that a smaller number, say 3, is associated with an earlier event than with a later one, 12. This association can be defined by a clock, as we do automatically by comparing the order of a series of events with the measurement of the passage of clock time. This is how we live our life. So in other words, by referring our experiences to a clock or a calendar, we are making time an objective concept, which is, of course, is pure fabrication. Time is subjective. Furthermore, in our perception of time, there are different modes in our daily maze of activities. We pass through various time zones without much difference about the thought of the difference between them. For example, there's clock time that we just referred to, which measures time numerically in relation to a series of events. So I get up in the morning, I meditate, I read something spiritual, I walk the dog, I have breakfast, and I leave for work. And 2.5 hours have passed. Then there is psychological, which is identification with the past and a projection into the future. Well, I was born in New York, and I went to high school, and I went to university there. And then I plan a trip to Alaska and my retirement. Now, these trips down memory lane and these projections into the future form a part of our sense of self because they're always linked to our identity. This existential or I time that we experience in our lives is a series of events that occur in the length of time that we have available to us here, reminding us of the stark reality of its limitations, since it's always running out. Now, there are other modes of time perception, such as historical time. We talk about ancient India or ancient Greece, ancient China. We have philosophical and metaphysical time. We have poetical time and archaeological and geologic time, and the time of quantum physics. And we say, well, a particle can travel faster than the speed of light. Two particles once closely related and then separated by vast distances change simultaneously, giving rise to this idea of a seamless universe or a holoverse. And then there's string theory, with 11 or so dimensions all existing simultaneously, which turn the concept of time on its head. So which time, whose time, is correct? Obviously, the time of a physicist is not that of a poet. And the time of a mystic is certainly not that of a CEO of a big corporation. The time of the calendar cannot tell us how long to cook green beans like a clock can, but it can indicate when we should plant them. By recognizing that there are these various modes of time perception, we begin to understand that there is not a single concept of time. How we interpret and experience time and its duration depends entirely upon how we think about it. It varies vastly under different circumstances. So what are the dimensions of our day-to-day experience of time modes? For seekers of truth, this practical perception, this time perception, is the most relevant. Every one of our experiences in daily life, whatever it happens to be, takes place in a unique instant of time. An instant that divides the so-called past and future as if we can divide time. That particular moment we call the present. And as we just said, the present is a split-second perception of a short-lived interval. And the past is a memory, and the future is simply a projection of the mind. So in truth, we only experience the present. We spoke about this yesterday. We only experience the now. Because in our movement through time, we pass from the future to the present into the past. When you remember the past, as when you project the future, you're doing it in the present moment. There was never an instant when we are not in the present moment. Now, Swami Vivekananda makes an interesting comment. He says, there is no break in time beyond what we make. What difference is there between 10 o'clock and 12 o'clock except what we make by certain changes in nature. Time flows on the same. That is why our spiritual teachers, especially the Buddhists and the Vedantists, emphasize the practice of living in the present, of giving full attention to whatever the moment presents to us. By doing this, we accept what is. Otherwise, we cannot give our attention fully to something and at the same time resist it, because that divides us. When we try to remain in the present moment, it helps us to live meaningfully in a more connected and a deeper level. The past and the future don't really have any reality of their own. Just like the moon reflects the light of the sun, it has no light of its own. In a similar way, our past experiences and the so-called future borrow their reality from the present. Again, Swami Vivekananda says, the present is all that is. All is here right now. One moment in infinite time is quite as complete and all-inclusive as every other moment. All that is, was, and will be is here in the present. It is one complete whole. Now, we've talked about the dimensions of our daily time modes and how we use a clock to measure them. But how do we feel? How do we sense the passage of time of our day-to-day experience? One factor is age. Very young children live in the eternal present. And as they grow up, they learn sophisticated ways of delineating or fragmenting time and use such words as today and tomorrow, next year, and so on. Now, language itself conditions our thinking and perception. For example, just consider the use of verb tenses. We are constantly dividing time with language. The ceaseless flow of time is a continually changing perception. Sometimes it slows down, sometimes it speeds up, and sometimes it stops completely. The way we feel the sense of time passing, and then the actual way we estimate time duration varies. For example, we all know from our personal experience, if we are bored or we're tired, 5 minutes can seem like an hour. Or we're trying to meditate. 5 minutes can seem like an hour. On the other hand, if our minds are concentrated in something we love doing, art, music, reading, and so on, time seems to speed up. Although our subjective sensation of time passage has decreased, and we say, oh, I lost track of the time. And perhaps 3 hours have passed and we thought it was an hour. According to the yogis, in deep meditation, time stops because the mind stops. There's a Zen parable. It was a windy day, and 2 monks were arguing about the flapping of a flag. And the first monk said, the flag isn't flapping, the wind is blowing and it's making like. The second monk said, no, the wind isn't blowing, the flag is moving, the wind is not doing it. Third monk came up and said, the wind is not moving, the flag is not moving, your minds are moving. Time perception is a mental concept, depending entirely on the movement of our mind. So not only is time relative, it's a subjective perception, and we experience it in different dimensions and modes. The bottom line is, time is an illusion. Once Einstein poignantly wrote to the sister of a fellow scientist who had just died, And he said, for us convinced physicists, the distinction between past and present and future is an illusion, although a persistent one. We don't have a particular sense organ to perceive the passage of time like we have other senses that perceive in the external world. We feel it. It's an integral part of our experience. Now, the great spiritual masters have all demonstrated this illusory nature of time, yet they recognize time as a condition of experience, both inward and sensory. Their main focus is on the eternal present. Now, eternity is not a long, long time, but it is a state beyond time, without time. It's not an infinite amount of time. That which is eternal exists outside of time. But the great mystics have a peripheral sense of time. They use clock time, but they are completely free from psychological or existential time. However, for the unenlightened, for the rest of us, our existence in the world presupposes our being bound by time, especially by psychological time. And this is the great cosmic riddle that all truth seekers are faced with: how to deal with time. Now, fortunately, the experiences of the great mystics show us that becoming free from the domination of time doesn't happen through the solving of this riddle, but through transcendence. Swami Vivekananda says, the infinite is self-existent, eternal, and unchangeable. The passage of time makes no mark whatever on the dial of eternity in its supersensuous region. There is no past, there is no future. Again, he said, time is but the method of our thinking, but we are the eternally present tense. But practically, we all know our experience is something different. Now, our main problem in spiritual life is dealing with our time-bound mind. Our instrument may be blunt, but this is all we have to work with. Our thinking fragments reality by shredding it into conceptual bits and pieces in the time machine. Unfortunately, this is a universal phenomena of the human psyche. Since we experience time and its duration through the succession of our thoughts, then according to the mystic, the first step in getting out of time becomes possible when we learn to control our thoughts through systematic spiritual practice. It is universally recognized that in order to have spiritual transformation of our being, it is absolutely necessary to do this to experience our true divine nature. One of Sri Ramakrishna's disciples, Swami Akhandananda, told someone, "You have come for attaining infinity. Why should you look at the clock? The clock shows finite time. That is relative. You have got to remove these ideas from your mind if you aspire after infinity." The beauty of this philosophy is that we are the divine being right now. The infinite, timeless being exists fully in every perception, in every being, from the tiniest insect to the most distant galaxy. But the restless, incessant motion of our minds blocks this pure, serene nature. This moment, we could realize it if our mind would simply quiet down. Restraining this mental motion of the mind comes through the practice of yoga. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, The technique to achieve this can be summed up in 4 words of the second aphorism. Yogas chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is restraining the mind from taking various forms. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna chalks out various paths of yoga, and Swami Vivekananda has refined these into 4, as we all know, into jnana, bhakti, raja, and karma yoga, service or the worship of God and man. Regardless of what path or paths we choose to follow, the common factor of all of them is concentration. Real concentration is the means to enter the timeless realm on the other side of mind. Through persistent, steady practice of concentration and meditation on the divine within our own inmost divine self, the mind becomes more tranquil and transparent. Gradually, our experience of time changes. This illusory division of time that we've been flowing from the past to the present to the future begins to recede. And all time will have the tendency to merge in the eternal present. This incessant stream of thinking slows down, although it's a very dynamic state. When mind is concentrated, the mystics say the idea of time vanishes. I mean, the more time that passes unnoticed, the more we are forgetful of self, the deeper we are concentrating. And we all know this from our own experience, whether it's from reading a book, hopefully in our meditations, or in some activity, some work project. The more concentrated you are, the less aware you are of your own self, the more time vanishes. So as we learn to release ourselves from our thoughts, we begin to realize that actually we are much vaster and deeper than our thoughts. The moment we are able to grasp this very simple truth, there is a shift in consciousness from the lower mind that is dominated by time to an infinite being that is living, luminous in consciousness. Within the timeless dimension comes a different kind of knowing. This diversified world that we are experiencing now turns out to be a continuous existence without the slightest break anywhere. As Swamiji has mentioned, if you know one instant of time, you know all of time. The past, the present, and the future merge into timelessness. Time ceases to flow, it stands still. When all boundaries are broken, we pass from time into timeless existence. Thank you. Thank you. On Wednesday at 5 p.m., there'll be a reading for Seekers of God. On Saturday at 5, there'll be a reading from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And next Sunday, the 19th, the talk will be What is Spiritual Awakening by Swami Vedarupananda. Om Madhupatarthayate madhuksharanti sindhavaha madhvirna santhoshadhihi madhunaktamutoshasi madhumatparthivagum rajaha madhutyorastuna pita madhumano vanaspatir madhumagum astu suryaha madhvirgavo bhavantunaha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May the winds blow sweetly and the rivers carry sweetness to us. May the herbs and the trees be full of sweetness. May night and morning yield us joy. May the dust of the earth give us sweetness. May the skies scatter happiness. May the sun shower bliss. May the cows yield sweetness. Om, peace, peace. Peace be unto us all and to all beings everywhere.
Thank you so much, Pravrajika. Still trying, I probably was still trying to